The wind howled through the icy streets, carrying whispers of fate and mystery. On a bitterly cold New Year's night, as most people were nestled in the warmth of their homes, one woman found herself face to face with a life-altering decision. Elena Harper, a dedicated nurse working grueling shifts at the city's largest hospital, was driving home after another exhausting day. The snowstorm outside mirrored the storm within her, a relentless whirlwind of doubts, exhaustion, and the haunting feeling that something vital was missing in her life. But fate had other plans. Through the swirling snow, Elena's headlights illuminated a wreck, a mangled car half buried in a snowbank. Common sense screamed at her to drive past, to get home safely, but something more substantial compelled her to stop. What she found inside that car would unravel secrets tied to immense power, betrayal, and a legacy carefully buried beneath layers of lies. Who was the man slumped over in the driver's seat, his expensive watch glinting faintly in the dim light? Why was he alone in the storm, his face bruised and bloodied, as though someone wanted him silenced forever? This chance encounter would lead Elena into a dangerous web of deception, forcing her to confront her fears and fight for a truth that could change lives. Not just his, but her own. If stories of resilience, redemption, and gripping mysteries ignite your imagination, stay with us for the journey ahead. Don't forget to follow and share your thoughts. Each story we tell is a step closer to building a community where every voice matters. The snowstorm raged like a wild symphony outside Elena Harper's car, blurring the edges of her vision and sending flurries dancing in hypnotic spirals against her windshield. The hum of the car heater was her only companion as her hands gripped the wheel tightly, navigating cautiously down the deserted road. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, a culmination of weeks spent running on fumes, both physically and emotionally. She was just a mile from her small townhouse when the faint glint of something metallic caught her eye through the swirling snow. A car, mangled, barely visible under a growing blanket of white. Her foot instinctively hovered over the brake pedal, her heart pounding. Every rational thought screamed for her to keep going. It wasn't safe to stop in weather like this. Who knew what kind of danger lurked in the shadows of that storm? But then she thought about her patients, the countless people who had looked to her for help during her shifts. She couldn't turn away, not even now. Pulling over, she grabbed her coat and stepped into the blizzard. The wind tore at her, biting through her clothes and stinging her face. Her boots crunched against the frozen ground as she approached the wreck, her breath fogging in the icy air. A dark figure slumped against the driver's seat caught her eye through the shattered windshield. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. No response. The figure remained motionless. Panic began to swell in her chest as she yanked at the door handle, only to find it frozen shut. Using her shoulder, she shoved against it with all her strength. The ice cracked with a loud groan, and the door finally gave way. The bitter cold inside the car was suffocating, and the man's pale face was dusted with frost. Blood trickled faintly from his temple. She leaned in, her fingers trembling as she pressed them to his wrist. A pulse. Faint, but there. "You're alive," she murmured, relief washing over her like a tide. But getting him out wouldn't be easy. He was unconscious, dead weight, and the storm fought her every step. Snow soaked through her jeans, and the biting wind numbed her fingers. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she managed to drag him into her passenger seat. Slamming the door shut, Elena collapsed into the driver's seat, gasping for air. The heater hummed weakly, a blessing against her frozen skin. Her gaze flickered to the man slumped beside her. His chest rose and fell faintly, his face etched with exhaustion and pain. Who was he? Why was he alone in the middle of such a dangerous storm? Questions piled up in her mind, but there was no time for answers. The only priority was getting them both home, alive. The storm had eased slightly by the time Elena pulled into her driveway. Her modest home, usually a refuge of warmth and familiarity, felt foreboding under the heavy blanket of snow. She worked quickly to get the man inside, her body trembling. Once inside, she draped him in blankets and checked his vitals. The man was still unconscious but stable, for now. Up close, she noticed the small details. His tailored coat and the faint scent of expensive cologne that lingered even after his harrowing ordeal. A sleek watch glinted on his wrist, an elegant piece that seemed out of place in her humble living room. Hours passed, and the man stirred as dawn broke through the clouds. His brow furrowed, and his hand twitched beneath the quilt Elena had wrapped around him. She leaned forward from the armchair where she'd kept watch. "You're awake," she said softly, setting her coffee mug aside. The man blinked, his hazel eyes sharp but clouded with confusion. He tried to sit up, only to wince and instinctively clutch his side. "Take it easy," Elena urged, placing a hand on his shoulder to steady him. "You were in an accident. I found your car in the storm." He looked around, his gaze darting between the modest furnishings of her living room. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, strained. "You're safe," Elena reassured him. "This is my home." He nodded faintly but said nothing more. Elena hesitated before asking the question that had gnawed at her all night. "Do you remember your name?" The man froze, his jaw tightening as he stared down at his hands. Finally, he shook his head. "No," he admitted, his voice laced with frustration. "I don't remember anything." Elena's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice, but before she could respond, the sound of a door opening interrupted them. Her younger sister, Amelia, stepped inside, shaking snow off her jacket. Amelia was Elena's opposite in many ways. Brisk, pragmatic, and often skeptical. She froze when her gaze landed on the man, her eyes narrowing. "Who's this?" Amelia asked, her tone sharp. "I found him last night," Elena explained quickly. "His car had crashed in the storm. He was unconscious." Amelia frowned, crossing her arms. "And you just brought him here? What if he's dangerous?" "He's not," Elena said firmly. "Look at him, he's hurt, confused. He doesn't even know his name." Amelia wasn't convinced. She approached the man cautiously, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, from the faint bruise on his temple to the expensive wristwatch. "That's quite a piece," she muttered, nodding toward the watch. "Not exactly something you'd expect on someone just stranded." The man shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering protectively over the watch. Amelia straightened, her expression serious. "I'm going to check the crash site. There might be something there to explain this." As Amelia left, the room fell silent. The man's gaze dropped to his lap, his fingers tracing the edges of the watch. "I don't know who I am," he said softly, the frustration in his voice giving way to something more profound. "But I feel like someone out there knows, and they wanted me gone." Elena's stomach churned. She didn't know who this man was or what had brought him to her doorstep, but she knew one thing. She couldn't leave him to face whatever storm had driven him into hers. "We'll figure it out," she said firmly. "You're not alone in this." For the first time, he looked at her, a flicker of gratitude breaking through the confusion in his eyes. And for Elena, that was enough to know she had made the right choice, no matter the consequences. Amelia returned with a furrowed brow and a bundle of unease the following day. She dropped a folder onto the kitchen table where Elena and the man, whom they had begun referring to as Logan for lack of a better name, were sitting. Logan had been nursing a glass of water, his movements slow but steady, as if rediscovering the rhythm of his body. "I checked the crash site," Amelia said bluntly, pulling off her gloves. "It wasn't just an accident." Logan's hand froze mid-motion, the glass hovering inches from his lips. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. Amelia slid a photograph across the table. Tire tracks etched deep into the snow told a chilling story. "Someone forced you off the road. There's no doubt about it." Elena's stomach churned as she studied the photo. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Amelia replied. She pointed to a second photo showing the damage to Logan's car. "The angle of the impact, it's deliberate. Whoever did this wanted him out of the picture. Badly." Logan leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he stared at the images. The room felt heavier, the weight of an invisible threat pressing down on them. "But why?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. That's what we need to figure out, Amelia said, crossing her arms. You don't just get run off the road in the middle of a snowstorm for no reason. Elena turned to Logan, her voice gentle but firm. Do you remember anything? Even a fragment? Logan closed his eyes, his fingers tightening around the table's edge. It's like trying to grab smoke, he said after a moment. I see flashes. A man's voice, cold and sharp, papers on a desk. And his voice trailed off, his jaw tightening. I hated him. Whoever he was, I hated him. Elena reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. We'll figure this out together, she said softly. But first, you need rest. Logan nodded reluctantly, but Amelia wasn't satisfied. Rest won't solve this, she said. We need to dig deeper. His car's license plates might tell us who he is. Elena hesitated. Isn't that dangerous? What if whoever did this finds out we're looking? They already know where he is, Amelia shot back. And they'll come back. We're better off being prepared. Reluctantly, Elena agreed. As Amelia left to pursue her lead, Logan sat quietly, staring at the photos on the table. His hand drifted to the watch on his wrist, his thumb brushing the smooth metal surface. It was more than just a timepiece. It felt like an anchor, a lifeline to a world he couldn't remember. Elena noticed the gesture and tilted her head. That watch, she said. Does it mean something to you? Logan hesitated, his gaze distant. It feels important, he admitted. Like it's part of who I am. Elena nodded, filing the detail away in her mind. Whatever storm had brought Logan to her doorstep, she was determined to help him weather it. 2 days later, Amelia burst through the door, her face pale but triumphant. She held up a printout, her voice urgent. I ran the plates. The car belongs to Samuel Crawford. Elena's heart skipped a beat. Crawford? She repeated. As in Crawford Industries? Exactly, Amelia confirmed, dropping the printout onto the table. And it gets better. Samuel Crawford isn't just anyone. He's the heir to one of the biggest corporations in the city. But here's the twist. His stepfather, David Sinclair, runs the company now. And from what I've found, their relationship isn't warm and fuzzy. Logan, Samuel, stared at the printout, his face pale. The name felt like a jagged shard of glass cutting through the fog in his mind. Samuel Crawford, he murmured as if testing the name on his tongue. That's me? That's you, Amelia said firmly. She pointed to another document. Your stepfather took over the company after your father's death. From what I can tell, he's been consolidating power ever since. There are whispers of financial fraud, embezzlement, but nothing concrete. Samuel's hand clenched into a fist. The fragmented memories began to align. The cold voice, the cigar smoke, the suffocating weight of control. He made me sign something, he said suddenly, his voice trembling with frustration. I don't remember what, but it felt wrong. He said I was reckless and ungrateful. And then, the accident. Elena leaned forward, her voice steady. Do you think he tried to kill you? I don't think, Samuel said, his jaw tightening. I know. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Amelia broke the silence, her tone grim. If that's true, he's not just a businessman, he's dangerous. And he won't stop until he's sure you're out of the picture. Elena felt a chill creep up her spine. What do we do now? We stay ahead of him, Amelia said firmly. I've already contacted someone I trust. A retired detective named Ethan Rogers. He might help us dig up the evidence we need. Samuel nodded, his gaze hardening. I'm done running, he said, his voice resolute. If David wants a fight, I'll give him one. But I'm not going to let him win. Elena watched him, her heart swelling with fear and admiration. For the first time since she'd found him in the snow, Samuel looked like a man ready to reclaim his life. But the road ahead would be anything but easy. As the storm outside began to settle, the storm within was just starting to brew. Samuel sat on the worn couch, staring into the flickering flames of the small fireplace. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the face of his watch as if the movement could summon the memories just out of reach. Elena sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching him with quiet concern. "You mentioned signing something," she prompted gently. "Do you remember anything else about it?" Samuel closed his eyes, his brow furrowing. "It was in his office," he said after a moment, his voice distant. The desk was massive, dark wood, papers everywhere, and his voice, David's voice, cutting through everything. He kept saying I didn't understand and was reckless and ungrateful. He handed me the documents and told me it was routine. I didn't question it. I just signed. Elena leaned forward, her gaze intent. "Do you think those papers were part of his plan?" Samuel opened his eyes, meeting hers. "They had to be. He made me a scapegoat, didn't he? Whatever those documents were, they tied me to something. Something illegal." Before Elena could respond, Amelia entered the room, carrying a stack of papers and a laptop. Her expression was grim. "I've been digging," she said, dropping the materials onto the table. "And I think you're right. David's been siphoning money from Crawford Industries into offshore accounts. It's subtle, but it's there." Samuel's jaw tightened. "And I'm guessing my name is on those accounts." "Not directly," Amelia said, sitting down. "But the timeline matches. Those documents you signed, they're probably connected to this." Elena's stomach sank. If Samuel's tied to this, couldn't David frame him for the whole thing? "That's exactly what he's doing," Amelia said, her voice sharp. "Think about it. A wealthy heir with a reputation for being impulsive disappears after a car accident. The media paints him as reckless and irresponsible. Meanwhile, David cleans up the mess and looks like the hero." Samuel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "He's not just trying to take the company. He's trying to destroy me." Elena reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "Then we don't let him," she said firmly. "We fight back." The next few days were a blur of activity. Amelia and her retired detective contact, Ethan Rogers, worked tirelessly to gather evidence against David Sinclair. The dining table became their makeshift war room, covered with documents, photographs, and notes connected by lines of red string. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the story, a story of betrayal, greed, and murder. Samuel spent hours poring over the materials, his memories slowly sharpening. He recalled moments he had ignored before. The cold, calculating way David spoke, the subtle manipulation in every decision, the tension that hung in the air whenever they shared a room. But one memory stood out above the rest. "It wasn't just my accident," Samuel said one evening, his voice low. "My father, Albert Crawford. His death wasn't an accident either." Ethan looked up sharply. "What are you saying?" Samuel stared at the photograph of his father's wrecked car, one of many documents Ethan had unearthed. "The brakes," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed anger. "David tampered with them. He killed my father." The room fell silent, the weight of Samuel's words settling like a heavy fog. Elena placed a hand on his arm, her grip steady despite her chest tremor. "If that's true," she said softly, "then we have to prove it." Ethan nodded grimly. "And we will. But this isn't just about finding evidence, it's about staying one step ahead of David. He won't hesitate to strike again if he realizes what we're doing." Amelia tapped a document on the table. "We already have enough to raise questions, but we'd something irrefutable. Witnesses, signed statements, anything that ties him directly to the crimes." Samuel clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "He's gotten away with this for too long." Elena watched him, her heart swelling with admiration. Despite the weight of everything he had endured, Samuel's resolve burned brighter. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for his father's legacy, the truth, and the people who had suffered under David's corruption. But even as they prepared to strike, a lingering question hung in the air. How far would David go to protect his empire? As dawn broke, casting pale golden light through the windows of the modest cabin, the team gathered for another day of preparation. Their mission was heavier than ever, and each felt the looming threat of David Sinclair's reach. Hunched over the stack of documents, Ethan Rogers motioned for everyone's attention. "I found something," he said, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. He held a grainy photograph of a younger David standing beside Samuel's father, Albert Crawford, outside the company headquarters. This was taken 2 months before Albert's death. "What's interesting is the mechanic in the background. See him?" He pointed to a man in overalls barely visible in the frame. Samuel leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Who is he?" "His name was Henry Dalton," Ethan explained. "He serviced Albert's car days before the accident. The police report at the time mentioned tampered brakes, but the investigation was closed quickly. Henry disappeared shortly after." Samuel's chest tightened. "You think David paid him off? Or worse," Ethan said grimly. "But here's the thing, Henry's alive. He moved to a small town in Wyoming years ago and changed his name. I made a few calls and tracked him down." The room buzzed with a renewed sense of urgency. "If Henry can confirm what happened," Amelia said, her voice sharp with determination, "we might have the key to bringing David down." Samuel nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then I need to talk to him." Ethan hesitated. "It's risky. If David finds out you're looking into this, he'll come after you and Henry." "I'm done hiding," Samuel said firmly. "If there's even a chance Henry can give us the truth, I have to take it." Elena stepped forward, her eyes filled with concern. "Then I'm going with you," she said. "You're not doing this alone." Samuel looked at her, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't think I could." The plan was set. While Ethan and Amelia stayed behind to continue building the case, Samuel and Elena prepared for the trip to Wyoming. But as they packed their bags, an uneasy tension lingered. They all knew that confronting Henry might be the turning point, or the breaking point. The drive to Wyoming was long and quiet, the open road stretching endlessly before them. Samuel stared out the window, his mind racing with thoughts of his father, the company, and the man who had orchestrated so much pain. Elena glanced at him from the driver's seat, her voice breaking the silence. "What are you thinking about?" she asked gently. "My father," Samuel said after a moment. "He trusted David. We all did. And now," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Now I wonder how I didn't see it sooner." Elena reached over, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "You were young," she said. "David manipulated everyone around him. But you're seeing it now and doing something about it. That's what matters." They arrived in the small town just before dusk, the snow-covered streets quiet and unassuming. Henry Dalton's address led them to a modest house surrounded by towering pine trees at the edge of town. Samuel's pulse quickened as they approached the door. Elena knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness. Moments later, the door creaked open to reveal a wiry man with graying hair and cautious eyes. His gaze flicked between Samuel and Elena before narrowing in suspicion. "Who are you?" Henry asked, his voice wary. "My name is Samuel Crawford," Samuel said, stepping forward. "I believe you worked for my father, Albert Crawford." Henry's expression darkened, and he started to close the door. "I don't know anything about that." "Please," Samuel said, his voice urgent. "I know what happened to my father wasn't an accident. You were there. You can help me prove it." Henry hesitated, his hand on the doorframe. "If I talk, I'll be signing my death warrant," he said bitterly. "David Sinclair doesn't leave loose ends." Elena stepped in, her voice steady. "He's already tried to kill Samuel," she said. "We're not asking you to do this alone. We can protect you." Henry stared at them for a long moment before sighing heavily. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. Inside, the house was small but warm, with the faint scent of wood smoke lingering in the air. Henry motioned for them to sit, his movements tense. "I didn't know what I was getting into," he began, his voice low. "Albert was a good man, but David, he had a way of getting what he wanted. When Albert brought his car in, everything looked fine. But 2 days later, David came to me personally. He offered me a lot of money to replace the brake lines. Said it was just a precaution. Samuel's fists clenched. And you did it? I didn't know it was going to kill him, Henry said defensively. I thought it was some corporate game I didn't understand. But when Albert died and the investigation was swept under the rug, I knew. I tried to come forward, but David's people were everywhere. They threatened me, my family. I had no choice but to disappear. Samuel leaned back, his chest tight with anger and sorrow. You have to testify, he said. If we can connect David to my father's death, we can stop him. Henry shook his head. You don't know what he's capable of. I do, Samuel said, his voice firm. But I'm not afraid of him anymore. Henry studied Samuel for a long moment before nodding slowly. If you can protect me, he said, I'll tell you everything. As they left Henry's house, the weight of what they had learned settled heavily on Samuel's shoulders. Elena walked beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. This is it, she said softly. You're closer to the truth than ever. Samuel nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. And I won't stop until it's finished. At the cabin, Samuel, Elena, Amelia, and Ethan worked late into the night, piecing together the evidence that could finally bring David Sinclair to justice. Henry Dalton's testimony was the keystone of their case, corroborating years of financial records, manipulated contracts, and the forged documents Samuel had unknowingly signed. This isn't just a case of corporate fraud, Ethan said, his voice heavy as he spread the materials across the table. We're talking about premeditated murder, blackmail, and systemic corruption. If this goes public, it'll rock Crawford Industries to its core and take David down with it. Samuel stared at the photographs and documents, his jaw tightening. He's held my father's legacy hostage long enough, he said. It's time to take it back. Amelia raised an eyebrow. How do you plan to do that? David controls the board, the media, and half the city's power brokers. He's not going to let go without a fight. Samuel's expression hardened. Then we make him fight on our terms. I'm calling a board meeting. Publicly. Elena looked at him, her brows furrowing. Won't that tip him off? It will, Samuel admitted. But that's the point. He's expecting me to stay in hiding to play defense. He won't have time to maneuver if I show up in front of the board and the press. We'll present the evidence, and he'll have no choice but to face the consequences. Ethan leaned back, a thoughtful look on his face. It's risky, he said, but it might be your best shot. Samuel stood in front of the mirror the following day, adjusting his suit. The tailored fabric felt unfamiliar after weeks in the rugged comfort of the cabin, but it reminded him of who he was and who he needed to become. Elena entered the room, her hand brushing his arm. You ready for this? She asked softly. Samuel met her gaze, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. I don't know, he admitted, but I have to do it. You're not alone, Elena said, her voice steady. We're all with you. The words gave him strength. Together, they left for the Crawford Industries headquarters, where the stage for the confrontation was set. The boardroom was a spectacle of wealth and power, with its gleaming mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. Shareholders and board members filled the seats, murmurs of confusion and curiosity creating a low hum. At the head of the table stood David Sinclair, his commanding presence as sharp as ever. He gestured smoothly, delivering yet another speech about the company's future, one with false promises and carefully crafted lies. The double doors burst open, silencing the room. All eyes turned to Samuel Crawford as he strode in, his posture tall and confident. Elena, Amelia, and Ethan followed closely behind, their presence a silent testament to the gravity of what was about to unfold. Samuel, David said, his tone laced with mock surprise. What a dramatic entrance. I wasn't expecting you. I'm sure you weren't, Samuel replied, calm but firm. He placed a stack of documents on the table, meeting the eyes of every board member in turn. But you'll want to hear what I have to say. The tension in the room was palpable as Samuel began to speak. He recounted the story of his father's death, the documents he had been coerced into signing, and the web of deceit that had been carefully spun around Crawford Industries. "This," Samuel said, holding up a forensic report, "is proof that my father's death was no accident. The brakes on his car were tampered with, and the investigator who uncovered it was paid off to bury the report." Gasps rippled through the room. David's calm facade began to crack, his hand tightening around the table's edge. Samuel continued, spreading photographs and financial records across the table. "Here is evidence of embezzlement and fraud. Millions funneled into offshore accounts under David Sinclair's name. And here," he said, gesturing to a signed affidavit, "is the testimony of the mechanic coerced into sabotaging my father's car." The room erupted into chaos. Shareholders shouted in disbelief, and board members exchanged frantic whispers. David's voice cut through the noise, sharp and furious. "This is absurd," he snapped. "These accusations are baseless." "They're not," Samuel said, his voice cutting through the clamor. And the police seemed to agree. As if on cue, the doors opened again, and a team of officers entered, their badges gleaming under the light. The lead officer stepped forward, a warrant in hand. "David Sinclair," the officer said, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, embezzlement, and corporate fraud." David's face twisted with rage as the officers approached him. "You'll regret this, all of you," he shouted as they cuffed him. "This isn't over." Samuel watched as David was led away, his heart heavy but resolute. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. Turning to the board, Samuel spoke with a newfound strength. "Crawford Industries was built on integrity, vision, and trust," he said. "It's time to restore those values. This is just the beginning of a new chapter for all of us." A ripple of applause broke the silence, followed by a standing ovation. Samuel glanced at Elena and Amelia, their supportive smiles bolstering his resolve. As the meeting adjourned, the weight of his father's legacy no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a guide, leading him toward a future filled with hope and purpose. The aftermath of the board meeting was a whirlwind of media coverage and internal restructuring. Samuel Crawford found himself at the center of it all, not as the reckless heir portrayed in the tabloids, but as a man determined to rebuild his father's legacy with integrity. Yet even as the dust began to settle, the personal toll of the battle weighed heavily on him. One quiet evening, Samuel returned to the cabin where so much had begun. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Elena sat across from him, her warm gaze fixed on him as he stared into his glass of bourbon. "You did it," she said, breaking the silence. Samuel nodded, but his expression was distant. "It doesn't feel like a victory," he admitted. "David's gone, but the damage he caused runs deep. To the company, to my family, to so many people." Elena leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You can't undo the past, Samuel, but you can shape the future. What you've done, it's the first step, and you're not alone in this." Her words settled over him like a balm, soothing the ache that had lived in his chest for so long. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time in weeks. "You've been my anchor through all this," he said softly. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Elena replied with a small smile. "Just keep moving forward." Over the following weeks, Samuel threw himself into his work with a renewed sense of purpose. He met with employees, listened to their concerns, and implemented reforms to rebuild trust within the company. He reached out to community leaders, pledging support for local initiatives that aligned with the values his father had instilled in Crawford Industries. His relationship with his mother, Sophia, began to mend at home. The betrayal she had suffered at David's hands had left scars, but Samuel's determination to restore their family's honor gave her hope. Together, they worked to uncover and rectify the remnants of David's corruption, ensuring that no one else could exploit the company again. One evening, as they sat in the sunlit dining room of the Crawford estate, Sophia reached across the table and placed her hand over Samuel's. "Your father would be proud of you," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. Samuel smiled, the weight in his chest lifting slightly. "I hope so," he replied. Months later, Samuel stood on the balcony of the Crawford Industries headquarters, looking out over the city skyline. The sun was setting, painting the buildings in hues of gold and crimson. Beside him stood Elena, her presence as steady and grounding as ever. "We've come a long way," she said, her voice carrying a note of wonder. Samuel nodded. "And there's still a long way to go," he said. "But for the first time, I feel like we're moving in the right direction." That evening, they hosted a gathering at the Crawford estate, a celebration of the company's rebirth and a thank you to the people who had supported Samuel along the way. The dining room was alive with laughter and conversation, the warm glow of the chandeliers casting a golden light over the scene. Radiantly in a deep green dress, Sophia stood to make a toast. "To my son," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "To his resilience, courage, and determination to honor this family's legacy. And to all of you who stood by him when the world seemed to fall apart. Together, we have rebuilt a company and a vision for what we can achieve when we refuse to give up." Glasses clinked as the room erupted into applause. Samuel stood beside her, his chest swelling with an idea and gratitude. He glanced at Elena, who offered him a smile that spoke volumes. As the evening wore on, Samuel found himself outside on the balcony again, this time alone. The city stretched before him, a living, breathing testament to the potential for renewal. Elena joined him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That this is just the beginning," Samuel said, his voice thoughtful. "I want to do more, not just for the company, but for the people who believed in me, for the city, for you." Elena looked at him, her eyes searching his. "You already have," she said softly. In that moment, the weight of the past seemed to fall away, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. Samuel leaned closer, his forehead resting gently against hers. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" Elena asked, her voice barely audible. "For reminding me what it means to fight for something worth saving." As fireworks lit up the night sky, their reflections dancing in the glass windows behind them, Samuel knew with certainty that he wasn't just reclaiming his father's legacy. He was building one of his own. Together, they stepped back inside to join the celebration, laughter, and music filling the air. For the first time in years, Samuel felt at peace. And for the first time, he believed in the promise of tomorrow.